Well, well, good evening, everyone. My name's Robin Archer, and I'm the director of the Ralph Miliband program here at the LSE, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to our discussion this evening. Our discussion is sponsored by three organisations, the Ralph Miliband program, but also LSE Ideas, the LSE's foreign policy think tank, and the Phelan United States Centre, devoted to the study of the United States. And the focus of our event is going to be a brand new book by Professor Michael Cox, The Agonies of Empire, American Power from Clinton to Biden. If you got your Financial Times last weekend, you'll have seen it was given a very nice review notice pointing out how fluently it was written and what a nice book it was, not just for students and scholars, but one that would have a reach out into the wider interested public. Well, the book seeks to explain why the United States has found it increasingly difficult to exert its influence around the world in the last few presidencies. And to discuss this, we've brought together an eminent panel of three scholars. Let me just introduce you to them now. So first of all, we have Michael Cox himself. Mick is Emeritus Professor of International Relations here at the LSE, and he's also a co-founder of LSE Ideas, and he served in various capacities at Chatham House, at the Nobel Institute in Oslo, to the European Consortium for Political Research, at the Centre for Strategic Studies in Canberra, and also, I should say, as a much valued member of the steering committee of the Ralph Miliband program itself. He is the author or editor of a phenomenal number of books. Depending on where you look, you find it's either 24 or more. There's absolutely a prodigious amount of scholarship there, a number of which have come out in multiple editions. And they deal often with questions to do with the Cold War or with US foreign policy, but also with questions of empire, the ethics of international relations, democratization, and even recently a history of the LSE itself. Our second panellist is Peter Trubowitz. He's a Professor of International Relations and the Director of the Phelan US Centre here at the LSE, and he's held visiting posts at a number of institutions around the world: Princeton, Harvard, San Diego, Chile, Mexico, and Beijing. And he too has written highly regarded books dealing with American strategy, its relationship to politics, and American foreign policy more generally. And in addition, he's a widely respected commentator on US politics in general. Our third speaker is Caroline Kennedy Pipe. She is Professor of International Relations and International Security at Loughborough University, having previously been Professor of War Studies at the Universities of Hull, Warwick, and Sheffield. She's recently been president of the British International Studies Association. She's been a visiting fellow at the Rothermere Centre at the University of Oxford, and she's a special advisor to the House of Commons Committee on Defence. And she too has published widely on questions to do with Russia and its foreign policy, the Cold War, terrorism, drones, women as combatants, and issues to do with urban warfare. Well, at the moment, we can see two of our speakers because our third speaker, Caroline Kennedy Pipe, is having trouble with her picture, but she is here with us, and we do have our three speakers to contribute the ideas, which are, after all, what we're most interested in. And each of our speakers is going to talk for, 12, 15 minutes, and then after that, we'll have a good chunk of time for questions and discussion. Just before we start, can I emphasise that you need to put the questions into the Q&A box, and of course we'll try and pick out a number of those, but we can't necessarily deal with all of them. Do say who you are and where you're from, because it's of interest to our general audience. So before we start and turn to Professor Cox, can I just ask you to sort of join me metaphorically in welcoming our panel to our event tonight. Professor Cox. You're on mute.
Yeah, no, I just realized I made the cardinal mistake. Anyway, so firstly, thank you very much, Robin, for those very nice and generous comments. I'd like firstly to thank my publisher, Bristol University Press, which has done, I think, a wonderful job bringing this book out. So thank you to Bristol University Press, who have been very supportive throughout the process. The publishers often get a very bad rap. I'm trying to give one a very good rap, and I think they need it. They need a good rap these days. I'd also like to thank everybody on the Ralph Miliband Committee and the program more generally. I've been proudly associated with the Ralph Miliband program for many, many years, going back a long time. I may even be the longest serving member on that committee. I don't know, Robin, but it's been wonderful serving on that committee in celebration and commemoration of one of the great professors of the LSE, the very great Ralph Miliband, whom I actually did meet on a couple of occasions. So I can actually say I met the great man, but it's been wonderful serving on that committee with his family as well. And that's been a terrific privilege for me. And then last but by no means least, to Peter Trubowitz, Caroline, old friends, good friends. And as you pointed out, Robin, you know, well-established scholars who've made international reputation. So thank you to Peter and thank you to Caroline. Even if I can't see you, Caroline, I know your voice, but thank you very much again, all of you. Let me start with a very simple question. What's in the book? And I'm not going to make this too much about the book, although I'm bound to say something about it. What are the main arguments in it? Well, what's in the book, in a sense, is about 9 chapters. And the way I've organized it very simply, somewhat conventionally as well, I suppose one might argue, I've done it through presidents, partly because that was slightly easier to do. It gives a clear chronology, which I think is always important, one thing after the other. It's quite important to know that. Also, I think because presidents in the American system do define to a very large degree, not the power of the United States, but the strategies and the policies of the United States. So I think it's entirely legitimate to take that route. So I start a long time back, of course, with Bill Clinton, 2 terms, 92 to 2000. I first wrote something about him back then. I wrote a short book for Chatham House. We then get to the Bush presidency, which of course is very much defined in a very different world by 9/11 and what happened. Another one of those great unexpected events which reset and redefined US foreign policy for good or ill for the next 8 years, with particular emphasis and stress on terrorism and very much on the Middle East. I then deal with a very different president, again, a Democratic president, shape of President Obama, a 2-term president, a very different president, both to Clinton in many ways, but also very, very different to President G.W. Bush. Then there's a couple of chapters too on Trump. I couldn't avoid Trump, of course, goes without saying. I try to explain Trump. As it's easy to criticize Trump, and I suppose most people at the LSE would, but nonetheless, I think very important to understand what caused it, what brought it about, and to understand that maybe sometimes we overfocus on Trump as the cause of all the current problems rather than a manifestation and a symptoms of some deeper problems in the world more generally, and not just in the United States. And then finally, I deal briefly, but as fast as I could, with the Biden election and what Joe Biden has been doing. Of course, I couldn't bring it completely up to date because although we always like to think we can predict the future, and I do say a lot about Russia in the book, by the way, and I do say a lot about Putin and the way America tried to deal with Putin, both particularly during the Clinton years and then during the Obama, and then of course during the controversial Trump years. Nonetheless, I can't say that I say a lot about the Ukraine war because obviously it began, but I think I do try and explain the background to what's happened in Russia. And I think I said to you, Peter, some time ago, I started life as a Sovietologist, and therefore I was very interested in what happened after the Soviet Union. And I thought there was too much in the book originally on Russia. As I said in another debate we had, maybe think there's probably not enough because there's now so much focus on that. So that broadly gives you an idea of how I've structured the book and why I've structured it in the way. But look at the title. It's dramatic. It's called Agonies of Empire. And I suppose, therefore, the thrust of my argument isn't to underestimate American power. And indeed, I still think the United States remains the most powerful state in the world, the most powerful country in the world, in spite of all its challenges. And I, in a sense, hesitate to get involved in the decline debate, but I still don't buy into the argument, and I haven't done for many years, into the notion of American decline. But clearly, for different reasons, both domestic and international, the United States, still by far and away, in my view, the most powerful state in the world, is confronting enormous challenges. And what we're seeing today in Ukraine is maybe the last of many challenges that the United States has faced. It faced one actually only 6 months ago when it withdrew from Afghanistan. So we've been bookended, by both a withdrawal from Afghanistan, which was perceived as a major defeat for the United States. It was a chaotic withdrawal, at least. And then we're now facing an entirely new crisis, which I think is going to redefine world politics in dramatic ways, what is happening in Russia and Ukraine. So I can't say I predicted this war, and I don't think many people did, but I think tried to provide some background on why Russia has evolved in the way in which it has. I suppose the big picture I try to paint, or the big questions I try to answer, is you start with high hopes. You start with, if you like, the defeat of the Soviet Union, to put it bluntly, the retreat of communism, the unipolar moment, as it later became called by IR scholars, the moment when globalization was driving all before it, under a president who very systematically pushed globalization as a means of both prosperity and indeed a foundation, as he believed it, of political international peace. And I suppose the question is, whatever happened to those high hopes? What happened to the end of history moment, that term that was used by Francis Fukuyama? Whatever happened to the unipolar moment? Are we still in it? Whatever happened to the new American century? Remember, a number of books were talking about a new American century towards the end of the 1990s. And some were even talking then, and I think I may have been one of them, about an American empire. And I don't mind using that term empire. I use it loosely. I don't get too hung up on the term. But a lot of people today would say, well, talking of an empire today looks a little bit old hat. It's passé. That's no longer where we are. But that's where we were. That's where we were, certainly in the first 10 years after the end of the Cold War, I think it'd be fair to say. And the question is, what's happened over the last 20 years? Now, a great writer on international relations called Edward Hallett Carr, E.H. Carr, whom I've written about again, thanks for mentioning, Robin. But, Carr talked of a 20-year crisis between 1919 and 1939. It's a very great book, very influential book, a classic of IR. Has America been experiencing a 20-year crisis since 2001? I'm not quite sure we should use that term, but it's certainly gone through a period of 20 years of turbulence and challenge. And if you kind of then list the things that have happened, you begin with 9/11. You continue with the invasion of Iraq, highly contested invasion, as indeed it was, and opposed by one president later on, of course, President Obama, and with consequences which I think were severe. You could say it continues with the 2008 financial crisis, which brought Obama into office, essentially. There were other factors too, but I think the financial crash of 2008 did a lot to bring Obama into the White House. You could say then Trump, again, is a manifestation of a crisis in America, because he attacked so much of what was perceived to be fundamental to America's grand strategy. Its view of the world was so fundamentally upturned and turned upside down by President Trump. And then, of course, you end, as I indicated earlier on, Robin, with the Afghanistan withdrawal. Now, of course, there may have been good reasons in the end to get out of Afghanistan, but we all saw the pictures. It looked like Saigon 1975 all over again, when desperate people, Afghans trying to get out through Kabul airports in those terrible series. And again, that was seen as another indication of a crisis of American power. You mentioned my good friend Gideon Rack when he actually started talking, is this the beginning now of the post-American world, which people have been talking about, by the way, for the last 10 years. So there's nothing new in that particular debate. And then, of course, we come to the current crisis facing the US, and indeed facing Ukraine, facing Europe, and facing Russia today. So it's I suppose in some ways it is a story of high hopes not realized, dreams that were not fully realized, the end of history not exactly working out the way that Fukuyama, the liberal order, as he talked about it, the fundamental crisis of liberalism. And the unipolar moment, of course, was another illustration of that. America would remain dominant within the world forever. And the people will buy into that particular order as well. Even those who have been previously what I call recalcitrant states like Russia and China would become responsible stakeholders within that system. And globalization as an economic order would raise all boats together, although it wouldn't necessarily have losers. The winners would outstrip the losers and the consequences of globalization would be overall positive for the world economy. Whereas I think it's been far more disturbing. So the big question then, and I'll be brief on this because I want to hear what my colleagues have to say on this. I simplify the argument if I could, just for purposes of presentation, but I kind of put forward four main arguments, I think, why I would say what's gone wrong. You might want to pose it like that, but maybe four arguments as to where we might start thinking about where the agony comes from, if you like. I suppose in a more philosophical way, Robin, I think I'd kind of say hubris. It's an old word, derives, from Greek, having too much power, too much confidence. Can we say that America, in a sense, won too great a victory back in 1989 or 1991 and didn't think it could ever be challenged within the international system? I think the Iraq War, for instance, there's lots of arguments about why it came about, but I think it came about because America thought it could do it. And in some senses, let's say, get away with it. And I think there was a kind of hubris which began to evaporate, certainly after 2001 and certainly after the financial crash of 2008. But, feeling you can run the world, be the world, make the world, reshape the world in your own image, and maybe that's overstating what America thought it was doing, nonetheless carries within it certain dangers. And this is one of the great lessons of international history, the study of which proves that if you think you're going to win everything, in the end, you're going to lose quite a lot. The second aspect of it, I suppose, brings me back to globalization, about which I do discuss quite a lot, certainly in the first chapter, dealing with Clinton and then going on to the 2008 crisis. I think Clinton genuinely believed, as a good liberal he would, that globalization would drive all before it, all boats would be lifted, poverty would be reduced in many parts of the world, America would benefit, the West would benefit, China would benefit, India would benefit, everybody would be sucked into this huge economic new order. Well, it did create a lot of wealth. It certainly has created a lot of prosperity. It certainly helped China rise. Paradoxically, a Western economic order has helped China rise. It certainly helped India develop. I think that's also the case. And I think this is the deeper thing about it. And I think it was, who was it? It was one great writer in 1997, Danny Roderick, who said, we might lead to greater economic integration, but we're going to see deeper social fragmentation within societies, particularly within Western societies. And I think, again, that has been manifest, a kind of crisis within the West as much as a crisis of American power itself. And I think, Peter, you'll talk about that, I hope anyway, when we get to the whole question of polarization within the United States. It may indeed have deeper, wider roots than just American roots, but it has American roots as well. But I just wonder again, whether or not the crisis we're facing, which I think is manifest in the United States today, is also a crisis within the system and within the West more generally, a certain uncertainty about what is the West and whether the West really represents the future in a world that many believe is going to move to Asia and move to the East, which of course brings me to the next point, is that has there been a basic shift of power to the East? The rise of an Asian century, as many writers have talked about, which it's been beneficial, obviously, to Asia. And many people in the West have welcomed it because it's made a lot of people a lot of money, many markets and all the rest of it. Nonetheless, has this shift to the East, Easternization, to quote Gideon Rack, title of one of Gideon Rackman's excellent books, Easternization has that again done something to erode the self-confidence of the West, that they no longer are going to run the world. And maybe that's also part and parcel of the discussion we have to have. And then two final points just to quickly throw in. Some would even argue that liberalism is the problem, has been the problem. And certainly important influential writers like John Mearsheimer and others have said, really, the problem is liberal hubris. The idea that you could create a liberal world order was always an illusion. Trying to make people like us was always an illusion. And what liberalism has led to, in a sense, is some of the many problems we're facing today. A crisis of the liberal order should not be so surprising, given that liberalism itself, according to John Mearsheimer and others, is the problem. That is the problem itself. Finally, of course, and this, of course, brings us back to where we are today, certainly with the rise of China and, of course, what's happening between Russia and Ukraine. Where might the West and the United States have fitted in what we would now call revisionist states? And what I try and deal with in the book is the various attempts by the US, mainly the US, because it's a book on the US and on US foreign policy, the degree to which the attempts were made to bring in, the two outsider states, if I can call them that. One post-communist, quite clearly in the shape of Russia, and one clearly still run by the Communist Party in the shape of China. And we might want to open that up for a debate. Was that ever achievable? From an IR realist point of view, you'd say, well, that was always a utopian dream. You could never bring in states because states are rising powers are going to always challenge the order. Again, that's something that John Mearsheimer has always argued. And the states around the world, like Russia, simply were not going to be incorporated into a Western liberal order because they were opposed to that Western liberal order and indeed have combined together, particularly over the last 5 to 6 years, working together, China and Russia, to challenge that liberal order and to challenge America's position of dominance within that order. And maybe that's partly what we're seeing being played out, some would argue today, in Ukraine. So there are many reasons we can explain in broad terms, Robin, to bring my comments to a very rapid conclusion. I'll end with two paradoxes, if I could. The paradox of victory and the paradox of power, if I might use those terminologies. The paradox of victory, in some ways, and I think Peter has written about this so well, is you beat the Soviet Union, but you lose a clear enemy. And the Cold War, for all of its costs and downsides and dangers, and they were very real, nonetheless, it kind of solved a lot of problems, if I might put it, Peter, both at home within America and for American alliances. And I just wonder that the victory itself produces its own problems of not having a clear, what I call global north against which to oppose and to bring about consensus within America itself. I know you've written about this, Peter, so I'll be interested to hear your thoughts about what I call the paradox of victory and also the paradox of power. America still retains huge, vast amounts of power. Whatever happened in Afghanistan, even what happened in Iraq, even after the 2008 financial crisis, we're still looking at an extraordinarily powerful state within the world, which may be facing all the challenges I've met, but we still got to confront the simple fact, and one that some people don't either like or don't even agree with, this enormous power. So what happens to America, therefore, is of enormous significance, not only for Americans and within America itself, but for the rest of the world. Basically, in some sense, the old slogan is that when America catches cold, everybody else is going to get double pneumonia. Well, what America does or does not do has enormous significance for the rest of the world, as we are seeing being played out in the great crisis unfolding between Russia and Ukraine. So with those comments, I'll conclude. I hope I took up my full 15 minutes as I thought I would, bound to, but I'm really looking forward to what Peter has to say and then Caroline. Thanks very much, Robin.
Thank you, Professor Cox. So now to Professor Trubowitz.
Great. Thank you, Robin. Excuse me. It's great to be here on the platform today with you, with Mick and Caroline, and to have an opportunity to discuss Mick's wonderful new book on U.S. foreign policy since the Cold War. So let me just begin like right up front by saying that I highly recommend the book. Really, to anyone who wants to understand the state of America in the world today and how it got here. It really, the book has everything that, those of us who've been reading Mick for a long time have come to expect of Mick Cox's writings about the United States. It's got a great historical narrative. It's not just one thing after another, as he said at the outset, that skillfully weaves together, I think, very large international structural developments with a deep understanding of America and its presidencies and politics. And I think a knack for being able to separate the wheat from the chaff when it comes to describing the evolution of U.S. foreign policy. So, it's well worth the purchase price. I encourage people to pick up a copy. It's very well done. The book's core message, I think, and Mick alluded to this, is that the end of the Cold War created really as many challenges for the United States as opportunities. And he called this kind of the paradox of victory and the paradox of power. America had great power and no rival to speak of, but the collapse of the Soviet Union, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, it really no longer had a clear-eyed mission, a clear overriding international purpose. And you know, the problem was actually captured very nicely by an old advisor to several Soviet leaders, a guy named Georgy Arbatov, who shortly before the Soviet Union fell, told or warned an American audience. He said, in quotes, "We're going to do a terrible thing to you. We're going to deprive you of an enemy." And much, I think, of Mick's book is about really how successive presidents, running from Clinton to Biden, responded to the geopolitical vacuum that the Soviet collapse left behind, and the various developments and events that have intervened along the way, you know, from the September 11th attacks to the 2008 global financial crisis, to the COVID pandemic. And what emerges, I think, in Mick's telling is less the kind of unified, liberal, hegemonic strategy that John Mearsheimer and others described, than an America that is, as Mick points out, as he just said a moment ago, immensely powerful, but also at the same time internally divided and confused about its purposes. And as a result, where some scholars have seen great consistency in US foreign policy over the past 30 years, I think when you read Mick's book, what he sees is more variation from one president to the next. And so one of the very nice things about the way that it's organized by presidency is that's drawn out for the reader. That is really nicely captured. And I think this portrait of American statecraft since the Cold War is a compelling one. I share many of the ideas or the arguments that he develops, I think are spot on. But I also think that the book begs some important questions that I offer in the spirit of spurring discussion this evening about the book, but also the historical moment that we find ourselves in today. And one question is whether the war that Putin has unleashed on Ukraine has brought this long post-Cold War, this 30-year crisis, if you will, to a thundering end, one crisis bringing another one to an end. And if so, what the vacuum is going to be filled with? I mean, will it be filled by cascading nationalisms? Will it be filled by an emboldened European Union, perhaps with Germany at the helm, that stretches further eastward? Or by a circling of the wagons by China and a much diminished, weakened Russia? And how might all of this impact the United States, US foreign policy going forward? I mean, you know, will the forces that Putin's actions have set in motion produce the kind of programmatic and lasting shift in US grand strategy that, frankly, 30 years of geoeconomics, democracy promotion, and America first did not? I think that's a big question out there right now. And a lot of people are, see the American response and the Western response as suggesting that to Putin's war that seeing this kind of first month and the additional actions that were laid out today in Brussels as an indication that the United States and the West have kind of got their mojo back, and there's going to be a real clear, purposeful, programmatic policy going forward. And I think that's worth scrutinizing. A second question actually follows from this, which is whether or not the Soviet threat was the glue that held American statecraft together. And this, of course, is the implication of Arbatov's famous quip, and to some extent the argument that Mick develops in Agonies of Empire and the point about the paradox of victory. But there's more to the story, I think, and I don't think Mick will disagree with this, but there's more to the story of American purposefulness during the Cold War than geopolitical imperatives, important though they were. And Mick has written about this, and I've written about this, but I'm going to kind of argue with both Mick and myself here right now and say that one can make a strong case that the reason that American statecraft was so much more consistent during the Cold War than it has been since is that American leaders during the East-West struggle were very careful to balance international commitments with a commitment to economic security and expanding inclusiveness at home. And there are several reasons for this, but what makes it relevant, I think, to the story of American statecraft that Mick tells is that this commitment to social democracy, broadly defined social welfare, also weakened in the United States in the 1990s, as it did across much of the advanced industrialized world. Of course, it began back in the 1980s with Thatcher and Reagan, but it accelerated in the 1990s, and it was being pushed by center-left, not center-right politicians by that point in time, whether it was Clinton or Tony Blair or Schroeder in Germany. In the American case, it was part and parcel of Clinton's turn to what was called at that point in time, geoeconomics as a replacement for geopolitics. And that Mick really does a great job, describing in the book. And that, for all their many differences, actually continued under Bush and Obama and even Trump. Indeed, like the absence of the geopolitical threat over the past 30 years, I would argue that this is the other great development that shaped American foreign policy, that has shaped American foreign policy since the Cold War, and that it has led to a kind of hollowing out of the domestic social contract that previously had been the undergirding or the bedrock of America's commitment to the liberal order that presidents from FDR on worked so hard to expand and nurture. And there is, I think, alas, a kind of final question or point here too, that follows from this. Could it be that Biden's response to the geopolitical forces that Putin's war has set in motion, however strategically sound it may appear right now, won't be enough to put America's foreign policy back on an even keel? For if Arbatov was only half right, and it takes more than an enemy to get Americans to consistently and programmatically buy into ambitious foreign policies, it does raise the question of whether we could be in for something worse than what we've seen the past 30 years, namely an America that is maybe unwilling or incapable domestically, not because it doesn't have the power, the raw, relative, material power, but because it doesn't have the political will or the, perhaps even more importantly, given what we have seen over the last 5 to 6 years in the United States, the domestic capacity to rise to the international challenge. And I think maybe on that, I think I'm within my time limit here. I think, Robin, I'll leave it there and we can turn it over to Carolyn.
Great, thank you very much, Peter. So yes, indeed, we turn now to Caroline Kennedy Pipe, who is here, and welcome, and let's hear from her.
Thank you, Robin, and apologies that my camera won't work. But Mick, thank you so much for the invitation. Reading Mick's book before it was published, I pondered very much Mick's career, of course, very much, I think, like many of us, a great admirer of Russia until recent events, and if not of Russian politics, of the Russian people, literature, culture, and everything that it has offered the world. So today I feel very sad about obviously everything that is occurring, but pondering and reading Mick's book, one of its many virtues actually is the lessons it contains for our own troubled times when we again have a major war in Europe. Mick talks about the lessons of history and very recent history and reflects very much on the legacies of the Cold War between the opposing blocs. And of course, we have only just had the 30th anniversary of the end of the Soviet Union, a humiliation very much on the mind of Mr. Putin over the last few months, as he brooded on the many obvious geopolitical limitations which have been visited upon Russia. Mick's chapters on Clinton, a president who was notoriously close to Boris Yeltsin, tell us a very great deal about getting Russia wrong, whatever the intentions may have been. Throughout the 1990s, and especially, I think, the false reading of the system which was developing under both Yeltsin and, of course, his successor, Putin, and recently released material and documents from the Presidential Library in Arkansas actually really reinforces Mick's analysis of what happened during the Yeltsin-Clinton years, with Yeltsin warning Clinton quite openly about the dangers of humiliating Russia. And indeed, in one fascinating document, Yeltsin warns Clinton that there are those around him in the Kremlin who would have the ambition to retake Crimea and would do so. Nonetheless, Yeltsin recommends Putin to Clinton, and really what we have, it seems to me, is, and I'll be very interested to hear Mick's views, Bill Clinton deciding to ignore the type of advice that Yeltsin was giving him about the state of the Soviet system, about the nature of the rivalries within the Kremlin, and in particular, warning of the dangers of encircling Russia with the expansion of NATO. Now, Mick also, in his book, he ends, in fact, the book with talking about the importance of local politics in the making of American foreign policy. And despite all the verbal promises given to Mikhail Gorbachev that NATO would not expand to the east and onto Russia's truncated borders, Clinton, of course, oversees the integration of Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary into the NATO alliance. And one might think that a canny operator like Bill Clinton had his eye set not on what Russia and how Russia would respond, but rather the Eastern Central diaspora who would bring him again and help win him the White House. So Mick's, I think, fusion of the imperatives of local and regional politics to any president seeking to take the White House seemed to me almost at times in his narrative trump, if you like, any commitment towards the liberal international order. And of course, as we know, the March 1999 NATO intervention bombing Serb forces in Kosovo infuriated the Kremlin. That Primakov actually turned his plane around from heading to talks with the United States when he got the news of this. But the question this evening is not just about my own particular hobby horse, about misreading Russia, but also about the shape that US foreign policy took after 9/11. As Mick knows only too well, the late Nicholas Renger and I wrote a piece after 9/11 in which we argued that 9/11 was indeed a shock to the system, but didn't fundamentally alter any of the basic geopolitics of international relations and the way that we should perceive great power rivalry. I think one hugely important question is why after 9/11, the US took its eye off the strategic ball, becoming embedded in unwinnable wars in the Middle East. And Mick makes much of this obsession with a global confrontation with various militants, jihadists, and Al-Qaeda, permitting, if you like, an obsession with the United States away from its core interests. And I couldn't agree more, looking back at the hubris prior to the invasion of Iraq. Of course, it wasn't just Iraq that the United States believed it had the ability to reshape. It was Lebanon, it was Libya, it was a much wider Middle East. And the arrogance of power, if we can call it that, I think took the United States down the wrong pathway. In this period of 20 years of war in the Middle East, that obsession, as I said, with a global war on terror, the minute detail, the incredible expenditure of those wars, and then, of course, the misreading of the Arab Spring, meant not only that Russia could regroup under Vladimir Putin and do so crossing many red lines, whether it was in Georgia, whether it was in Crimea, or indeed in the Syrian war, in which Mr. Putin proved himself adept at frustrating any American attempts at regime change. And only this weekend, of course, we've seen the pictures of Mr. Assad on his international trip around the Middle East. And again, the reshaping of Middle Eastern politics. So Russia regroups. Russia finds itself in the popularity of Mr. Putin, at least until this war. And of course, in 1991, 80% of Russians polled were very favorably inclined towards the United States. Only a decade later, that position was entirely reversed. So that breakdown, I think the question which is explained in Mick's book is how did the US get global politics wrong? The misreading of Russia, I think, is certainly one thing, but this also, I think, misreading of the alliance that has emerged, however durable it might prove to be, between China and Russia. And we need only think of those conversations in and at the Beijing Olympics to see very clearly that with economic sanctions, with the isolation of Russia post-2014, a different kind, a different tilt, a different regrouping has emerged. India, Pakistan, China refusing to outright condemn Russia. And what does that mean in terms of where Mick leaves his book just on the eve of that reshaping of the European balance of power, quite rightly pointing out in his own talk that this is a tremendous moment in terms of reshaping both the European security architecture, but more broadly, an understanding of the international system. Now, in 1991, some, perhaps we could call them idealists, perhaps we might call them wrong-headed liberals, talked about some of the future challenges that a Westphalian system might have to confront when dealing with Russia. Russia has always rejected the post-1991 Western consensus of a certain reading of sovereignty, a certain reading of geopolitics. And I think because we have misread Russia, the American foreign policy elite, we're faced with really very serious consequences in terms of what will now happen in terms of the European architecture. The Sino-Russian alliance, rather than the Sino-Soviet alliance, that dates me, is almost the perfect storm, it seems for me. The reemergence of Germany, which will occur as a major European military power. The ripping up, if you like, of the Russian relationship with Germany through the cancellation of Nord Stream means it's vitally important that the United States leads in terms of not just NATO, but rather than endlessly talking about a tilt to the Pacific, to see that actually the Pacific, the Asian, Eurasian worlds are, in the Russian view, and always have been, as well as the Chinese, intimately linked. A tilt away from one doesn't mean that that tilt will be followed by the Russians and the Chinese. So to see the war in Ukraine as coming out of Putin's ambitions to create a Eurasian security buffer is, I think, something that American analysts, as Mick brilliantly shows, under every president has got wrong. And there's something else I think that's worth us discussion. The Chinese, of course, have been buying up ports all around the world. The European dependency for its energy on Russia, will that be filled by a new dependency on the United States, who can also make enormous profits through supplying the Europeans? Or is it, and perhaps I'm now too cynical about this, is it that the Chinese will also enter the European and have entered the European energy market? So it's not, I think, and the late Fred Halliday, of course, wrongly predicted in the 1980s the demise of the United States. It's not so much the demise of the United States, its internal fracturing, its obvious problems in terms of race, class, economy. It's whether the United States will be outmaneuvered not by two separate problems, but by one problem, which is that of the Kremlin and Beijing having moved much closer. That is the threat, I think, to not US hegemony, but certainly US influence in the world. And I'll stop there.
Right.
Oh, thank you very much indeed, Professor Kennedy Pipe. Well, it's time now for some questions and discussion. Do keep sending your questions in. Do say who you are and where you're from so we can announce it as we select them to put to the audience. I'm going to start with a question for Professor Cox from Kevin, who's from Birmingham, who asks, to what extent do you feel that US foreign policy in the last 30 years has shifted from Europe to other parts of the world? And how do you think the current Ukraine crisis will influence it moving forward?
Yeah, thanks for that, Kevin. I'll try and be brief because there's so many great questions out there, and I'd love to come back and talk to Caroline and Peter, but leave that aside for the moment. Well, in some ways, the Cold War privileged Europe. Yeah, it did. You know, the primary threat was seen to be the Soviet Union. It was a military threat, NATO, and there was the Warsaw Pact. Therefore, the primary the primary emphasis of the United States, the primary, but not the only, and I think we've got to make a distinction there, was towards Europe, which in a sense was highly privileged in that sense by the Cold War. And obviously huge changes ever since. The rise of Asia, the emergence of China as a major challenger and a major economic player in the international system. All that has meant that Europe's privileged position, insofar as there was one, has clearly come under some challenge. My answer, however, would still be that America, I mean, this gets back to the question of America as a global power. I mean, the consequence of World War II that America faced both, not just southwards to South America, the old Monroe Doctrine going back to 1823, but also not only face across the Atlantic to Europe, but also faced across the Pacific towards Japan and then towards communist China, which saw as part of that relationship with Russia in the old days, if you like, the Cold War days. So in that sense, I mean, I think the United States has always had a global perspective. Even if you look through the work of people like George F. Kennan, he said, look, the first place we've got to kind of protect and develop from communism is going to be Western Europe, later Europe, of course. It's going to have to be Asia, Japan, etc., the threat there, and also the Middle East because of oil and various raw materials coming out of there. So in some ways, I'd always say that the United States, I think, has always had a globalist perspective. And it's an interesting question which has also been raised, and I'll make this a quick point but end. Some have now said, well, because there's so much focus on what's going on in Europe at the moment, obviously as a consequence of this particular war. I mean, today or yesterday, was it President Biden was in Poland. This, therefore, is going to take away America's focus in on Asia. I don't buy into that, really. If anything, what's happening between Russia and Ukraine is in some sense making the United States look even more closely at what is happening in Asia Pacific, and particularly, of course, with relationship between China and Taiwan. The other thing I'd simply say is simply look at America's global reach. You know, its global economic reach. It's the biggest foreign direct investor in the world. It sits at the heart of the world financial system, more so than ever today, actually. The dollar still remains, you know, the primary currency in the world, and is New York, and decisions made by the Federal Reserve which shape all of our lives. So it remains a global power. The real question to me is not Europe or Asia or Europe and somewhere else, but how effective it has been in developing strategies and policies towards the world as a whole. And as I try and show in the book, it's been effective in some regards, but as Caroline, I think, has already indicated, following some of the arguments I make, you know, there's been some real problems in that as well. But it remains the global power with the global reach. I think we've got to conceive of America in that particular way. That's the way I would anyway. Thanks for the question.
Okay, and do keep your thoughts about the panelists' points, and we do want to come back to that at the end. We've got lots of questions. So I'm going to continue on now with a question for Peter. It's from a Dr. Manning, who is a former colleague of Mick at the LSE, who asks, did US post-war foreign policy collapse with Trump? If he was still president and the Republicans controlled both the White House and Capitol Hill, how would he have responded to the Ukraine invasion? Would the transatlantic alliance still exist? And I think this is pertinent to ask you because you did emphasize Trump somewhat more as distinctive a president than perhaps in the original contribution.
So can I missed the very first part of the question, Robin. It's the post-Cold War and not.
Did US post-war foreign policy collapse with Trump?
So I would argue that in a way, so this is a great question, that in a way, the core operating principle that guided, at least geopolitically, that guided US foreign policy after World War II, so from the post-war period on, was really, was to ensure that no single power or group of powers gain control of the Eurasian landmass or undue influence. And that's why, to just go back to Mick's previous point, you can't say that the US was focused only on Europe. It was focused on Asia as well. And the challenge, especially once you had the alliance between the Soviet Union and China, was to keep it in check and to contain it and so forth. And I think that was kind of the overriding principle. So with the end of the Cold War, and this really takes us to Carolyn's point, which I I agree with that premise, which is really not original with US policymakers. You can bring it all the way back to a former director of the LSE. Everything starts at the LSE, Sir Halford Mackinder, and that you need to prevent any single power from gaining control over the Eurasian landmass. And that was a cardinal principle of British foreign policy and for a very long time, US foreign policy. With the end of the Cold War, that disappears. And so what we see, and this is what I think Mick is documenting for us, is president after president trying to fill. It's like that problem, in quotes, Carolyn's point is it never really went away, but from the perspective of American policymakers, that problem did go away. And in my view, the only president since the end of the Cold War that tried to tackle this strategically was Obama, actually. And I say that because when Obama moved to, and he tried to do it through unusual means in a sense, actually, I mean, it steals a page out of the early Cold War. When Obama pushed for TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, at the same time that he pushed for TTIP, the trade relationship with the Transatlantic Investment Partnership with Europe, the idea behind that, the strategic logic behind it, was to retether those two regions to the United States, to strengthen it, recognizing that China was a juggernaut, and that China was, as Carolyn pointed out, expanding its influence, purchasing ports and so forth in Eurasia. And so the idea was to re-anchor the two ends, I think, strategically. In the case of Trump, we see none of that. And I mean, the question about like Trump and Putin, I mean, my view of this is that Putin interpreted Trump and those divisions in the United States as indicating or suggesting that the United States was too bemused by domestic concerns, to focus domestically, to be able to respond. I mean, the strategic calculation, and not just the US, but Western democracies in general, because they're experiencing many of the same things, the division and the fragmentation. The miscalculation was that he thought he could do Ukraine very quickly in blitzkrieg fashion. That was just a massive miscalculation.
Okay, thanks very much. And now a question I'm going to direct to Carolyn. It's from Adam Sisu, who's a high school student here in London. We're always very pleased to have high school students in our audience, as we often do. Adam Sisu asks, how genuine is the risk that the liberal international order falls, and how different would a world be where Russia and or China was hegemonic?
So Adam, thank you very much for your question. When we talk about the liberal international order, I think as both Peter and Mick have pointed out, it's been hugely contested in a shared rebuttal by both China and Russia of the legitimacy of that international order. And indeed, one of the features, one of the shared visions of Russia and China is a different reading of the international order, of international history, and a joint view that that Western international system must be resisted and recast. And what Russian scholars have argued for years is that they take a very different view of sovereignty to Western states, a rejection of the Westphalian view of the world. And here's the most interesting feature, I think, over the last 10, 12 years of the Russian view of sovereignty is not just the obvious rejection of Western intervention in places like Syria for regime change, But two things really. The Russians argue that sovereignty actually rests on a number of different characteristics, not least Mr. Putin has made it clear that Russian-speaking people remain under a Russian type of sovereignty. And the second issue is this difference that international order should be based on a shared set of values. And I think that part of the issue that we found since the 1990s with NATO is it became, as did its mandate for membership, it rested on values, not strategy necessarily. And that has brought us into an ideological collision with Russia and increasingly with China, because shared values simply do not exist. So what I would say is that if there is going to be an international liberal order, the question will be, is there room in it for actors who have different values? And part of, Adam, I think, where we have gone wrong in the post-1991 era, but gone wrong probably for very good reasons, is this insistence that there is only one value system in the world. Now, we might indeed be right with our emphasis on democracy, female human rights, individual rights, but that simply runs up against other types of value systems. So I think it's going to be fraught. And it sounds rather grand, but I certainly think that with whatever happens after Putin's war in Ukraine, there needs to be a concerted effort to rethink a reshaping. I'm not talking about necessarily a Versailles, perhaps more likely a Yalta, but some kind of attempt to recast the international system with some flexibility, away from simply a capitalist American model. And that's probably, Mick will castigate me for idealism, but we've got into this war, not just because of Putin's ambition, but also because, I mean, the Putins have been reading Halford Mackinder for years now. It's actually, taught at the Russian Military Academy. And if you look at the work of Alexander Dugin, for example, his theory of a multipolar world, it's pure Halford Mackinder.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm going to do another round of questions, but do keep your thoughts about each other's comments, because we'll come back to that. So now for you, Mick, it's from Keith Raffin, who's a former MP and a former MSP. Do you agree that Obama continually sent out the wrong signals of American weakness to Putin by, for example, saying that the use of chemical weapons in Syria would be a red line, when that was a line that was crossed and nothing was done? And the questioner goes on to ask about whether there was underreaction to Russia's invasion of Crimea.
Well, I mean, look, as somebody who was a very strong supporter of President Obama politically, I've got to hold my hands up and say he didn't get everything right. I mean, there's no doubt about it. I think he got a lot right, by the way. Let me just say what I think he got right. I think he got the economics right. I think Obama, with his team around him, did an enormous amount of intervention within the economy, within the United States and globally, and particularly in association then with Gordon Brown, to prevent the 2008 becoming a 1930s. I think we could have been quite close to that. So let's give him credit for that. I think he was also right, at least in broad philosophical and theoretical terms, to actually understand that the world was actually moving. It was shifting, that the kind of hegemony, to use that phrase, which America had experienced in a different era, maybe in the 1990s, that was no longer, a workable system, that you had to try and work with other powers, even rising powers, sometimes powers that didn't share the same values as the United States, to see if you couldn't create some degree of, dare I use the word, international society around which you could group. Now, that may be an idealistic interpretation of Obama. I think, thirdly, I'd also say in favor of Obama, and then I will answer your question, I promise. I think the very election of Obama, an African-American, was hugely symbolic. and sent out a message around the world about the nature of America. It was a huge soft power victory for the United States, very simply. And I think that should be recognized right across the world. The global South took to Obama very obviously, in ways, of course, they did not later take to Trump for all the reasons we've hinted at and many more. But I think the question is a fair one. It's a fair one. He said there will be red lines we will not cross on chemical war, chemical weapons which were used, and he didn't, and those lines were crossed. And you know, should he have reacted? Well, we know what he did. He tried to make every argument, and even used the British Parliament to make sure that the US did not get sucked into Syria. If an American president wants to make a decision, he will do it, and clearly he didn't want to do it. And you could say, therefore, that was a major error. He later wrote about this too, and also about the Libyan intervention, or non-intervention, or leading from behind. Was that a mistake? Probably in hindsight, and hindsight's a wonderful thing. We can obviously say that it was. However, at the time, and here's the context argument, and I know it's a bit tricky, but I think the context of the time, I don't think he thought that the American people would support any degree of serious US intervention into Syria. You know, I just generally thought he was looking at public opinion within the United States. That shouldn't always be the determining factor. And I think he concluded that that is not exactly where American people would want him to lead. And moreover, the complexity of the Syrian situation, which I don't even have to be talked about here, was such that it was very difficult to know which side to choose and who to support. And it was an extraordinarily complicated situation. But yeah, in answer specifically to that point, he should not have said those red lines. And when that red line was crossed, I think that that undermined his credibility. I'd also say, secondly, that maybe Obama, if I might put it like this, had maybe a too professorial approach to the study of world politics rather than a politician's approach, compared, say, to Clinton. I think, in those senses, he's a very different kind of democratic leader. But I suppose, again, I'm going to sound like an apologist for Obama, so I just have to go with this for the moment. I think simply the challenges that confronted Obama when he came into office were really huge. And I think I would obviously focus on some of the mistakes, some of the achievements, but I'd also focus on the larger world picture in 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12, yeah? What do you have? You have an unwinnable war in Iraq, which he opposed from day one. And he was actually quite keen to get out of Iraq. He was certainly very keen to get out of Afghanistan. Pressures made it very difficult for him to do so. He faced a possible meltdown in the global economy. And he faced at home, and maybe Peter could talk about this too, he faced a recalcitrant Republican opposition who didn't give him an inch on anything. And facing that kind of opposition, which he did, that's a pretty difficult context for a politician within which to operate. So that may sound a little bit soft on Obama. Yes, he made mistakes. Should he have even ignored Russia? Should he have not tried to reset relations? Maybe Caroline could come back on this. He tried to reset that relationship, for which he was highly criticized by the Republican. Was it worth one last effort? I think it probably was. Did it work? No, but then quite often initiatives like that don't always work.
Okay, thanks very much. So now a question for Peter from Andrew Lone, who asks, are Russia's other neighbours in the Baltic and elsewhere right to be nervous for what might come after the invasion of Ukraine? And what might it mean for China and its neighbours? Will Chinese policy of non-intervention and respect for sovereignty continue? Or might Xi's China feel emboldened to use military power to resolve claims against various other states?
Those are two big questions, very good questions. I think quickly on the first part of it, on the Baltics, yeah, they should be nervous, but I think, and they are, and they're expressing it. I would say two things. It is possible that, Putin was to kind of, in a sense, gamble for resurrection by expanding the conflict in that way. I worry more when I think about this general problem about inadvertent escalation, that NATO makes a mistake, that, you know, or that on the other side, on the Russian side, that you know, stuff happens, and it's very easy for lines to be crossed, and where you lose control of it. I mean, look, Putin's got his hands full right now. It seems pretty obvious, and that this does not match up with the original military planning objectives and so forth. That much I think we know is established, no matter what Putin says. And so I think the problem is that, you know, the United States and its and many of its other European allies need to find ways to reassure those frontline states without overstepping, without either putting Putin in a position where he feels like his back is to the wall somehow, or if you want, and to assume that he is looking for an opportunity to escalate, to give him an opportunity. So I think I think that is what Biden and other leaders have been trying to navigate, and, you know, and so far successfully. In terms of how China is thinking about this and what it might mean, well, I'll be interested in hearing what my colleagues think. I think they're watching this very closely, and there's a bunch of different parts of this that they're watching closely. First of all, they almost certainly have concluded, the Chinese leadership, that Putin miscalculated. Part of the problem may be, as Carolyn alluded to, the discussion at the Olympics between Xi Jinping and Putin, is that Xi Jinping got himself too damn close to Putin. It's very difficult to push back against the position that he took, I think, vis-a-vis Putin. But just what I think is what maybe have been a surprise. Now, you know, Chinese economy is not the Russian economy, but the extent, the ability of Western industrialized democracies to act collectively on the economic front, and especially to demonstrate the value and the power of the dollar through all of this, and having the reserve currency, has been just, I mean, that has got to have unsettled them, or something that they have clearly taken on board. So, you know, and I think they're watching closely to see the nature of the Western response over time that would matter perhaps in terms of their own calculations with respect to Taiwan in the future.
Okay, thanks very much. So, Carolyn, now here's a question from Javad
I think
Jamil.
Carolyn wanted to come in on that point. I saw her hand up.
Yeah, so I think it's a really interesting question, and thank you, Peter. So the pressure on non-NATO members like Finland and Sweden has been intense over many years, actually. And we need only think of the attack on a NATO member in 2007, the massive cyber attack on Estonia. So what Mr. Putin has calculated on is the pressure on Ukraine, not a NATO member, will keep a NATO response muted. But as Peter said, what Mr. Putin has been experimenting with, think of his comments on nuclear use, is escalation to de-escalate, escalate to de-escalate, to raise the bar, to lower it. And this, as Peter said, is an extremely dangerous game that is being played. Now, an attack on Finland would not necessarily, as a non-NATO member, spark Article 5. However, what has been clearly, I think, signaled to the Russians, that Finland, as a very close ally, would have at least, it should give him pause to think. But where NATO is caught is all of the arguments about air power in the west of the country, no-fly zones. As Peter said, these immediately bring about the possibility of Western airplanes being shot down, of then the whole conflict ratcheting up. And I think, horrendous though the casualties already are, these attempts at de-escalation, I think, have to be very seriously followed through, both in Ukraine and on the borders. Now, NATO has reinforced in Norway, in Estonia, and this is where I think the sentiment is no further. And here the other promise, of course, must be that Ukraine will not join NATO. And just as a point, sorry, I'm talking too much, note also that the Russians have been issuing threats very recently against Denmark because of its closer relationship with the US military. And we're all historians here, I think, in many ways. The Russians have even brought to bear a memo from 1946 in which they claim the Danes promised not to reinforce with foreign troops their islands in the Baltic. Mr. Putin is desperately, I think, trying to avoid any further reinforcement of NATO. But Peter's absolutely right. What I think should worry us all is this very dangerous game of nuclear escalation and then de-escalation.
Okay, thank you. Look, we've got about 10 minutes left. I want to try and bring the panelists into dialogue with each other. And let me just try and do that by picking up a theme which a number of you have mentioned and which Mick presented in his initial comments. And that is to say that of his four main arguments, two of them concerned liberalism and hubris. And the general claim was being made that there was a sort of hubristic embrace of liberalism, and other of the panelists have followed that too. And the question I'd like to ask sort of each of you, but if you could try and be concise so we can get in a couple of rounds.
Sure.
I mean, when is mobilising for liberal values hubristic, and when is it an appropriate response? Because the paradigm example of hubris was going into Iraq, and the general idea is really the conservative one, that how can people from a liberal society understand all the tensions in those societies? But in the current conflict in Ukraine, liberal values are clearly being mobilised as part of the sort of effort to create solidarity. So I just would like to ask each of you, starting with Mick, then Peter, then Carolyn, when is it appropriate to mobilise liberal values, and when is it actually hubristic?
Thanks, Robin. An impossible question to try and answer, but I'll do my best. On the question of Iraq, there's been a big debate in the IR community and amongst many of us, hasn't there, Peter and John Eikenberry and many others, about what kind of war this was. I would actually still say that it was, broadly speaking, a liberal war, in the sense that it was fought for certain kinds of values: democracy promotion, regime change. Very much an anti-realist war, and indeed well worth remembering, Robin, that most realists I knew in the United States actually opposed the war, including, by the way, John Mearsheimer. So I think that would be my answer. That's not a straight answer to your larger question. But I want to bring it really, I'm not trying to avoid your question, but I do want to bring it back to the point that Caroline made, which I really did want to pick up on, if you don't mind. It does go to the heart of the question about a liberal order. It was pretty obvious pretty early on, the very large number of states within the international system were either A, not liberal, or B, opposed the liberal order. And one of them clearly emerged, certainly by the late 1990s and into the early part of the noughties, namely Russia. Putin made it very clear he didn't buy into liberal values, and he didn't buy into an American-dominated liberal order. China never pretended for 1 second to buy into this liberal order. And a number of other states around the world and regions within the world did not buy into the liberal order. And that was a kind of hubris. Now, I have to say, personally, I much prefer a broad liberal social democratic order than I do any other on offer at the moment. But not all states within the order, in the system, accept that order. And I think that brings up Caroline's point so well on China and Russia. Now, I'm not going to say I got one thing right in my life in terms of predicting something, but I wrote an article back in 2017 on the China-Russia relationship, which I began to think was a very extraordinarily strong, potentially stable long-term alliance, not just based on power in a realist sense, but based on certain ideas against liberalism, against the liberal hegemon, the United States, and against the notion that certain states in the world, like the United States, had almost a kind of a hubristic liberal right to intervene into your internal affairs and change your regime. And I think that relationship between China and Russia, I think, Peter, goes back way beyond the 2002 memorandum as well. I'm sure we don't disagree on that. The 4th of February communique, the 4th of February 2, was an extraordinary communique. And I think it was a statement of intention. No limits. I mean, this was really, it had never gone that far before, but you can find them trace back that relationship. And I think that's why I totally go along with what Caroline was saying, that what we're seeing really is not, it's not trying to blame one side or the other. I mean, I'm not sure that's quite what IR scholars ought to be doing, although I have very clear views on the Russia-Ukraine war, don't get me wrong. But I think what we do see now is two fundamentally opposed orders emerging. One of which, of course, is clearly rotating around China and Russia, whose relationship is actually, I think, okay, it's problematic, no question about it, as a result of the war, no doubt about it. It's certainly unsettled China for all sorts of reasons. Nonetheless, as you've seen time and again, China's come down on the side of Russia, won't criticize it, won't. I think that tells us something, that there's something really at the heart of that relationship, which is deep, serious, and long-term. And that's what the 4th of February communique was saying. On the other hand, what we're also seeing on the other side, as a result of the war, and I'll end my point here now, as a result of the war, in a sense that the liberal order is almost being reconstructed, is it not? You know, a stronger transatlantic relationship, values, it's a war for democracy. The president of Ukraine said, this is a war not just for Ukraine's sovereignty, it's a war for the West. And so in a way, what this war is doing is further pushing apart these two conceptions of order, and these two conceptions of order are clashing and will continue to clash with great consequences for the international order, international system going forward.
Okay, thanks. If we keep it succinct, we'll get in another round, and if we don't, we won't. So, yeah.
Sorry.
Do you want to go to another round, or do you want to?
No, I want you to respond to this, but I'm issuing a general warning and that's succinct.
I'll be brief. So for me, I think on this question that you've raised, Robin, it's a tough question, but for me, I have no beef, or I think it's a good thing that Western democracies are mobilizing in response to this blatant aggression, that, you know, I know there's deep background conditions, NATO enlargement, that, you know, Russian revanchism, you know, but I think at the end of the day, this is the kind of thing that the Western democracies should push back at. They need to be careful about it, because this thing could become much larger than it is. So there's a line there that they need to be careful about. For me, there's no comparison to the US Western intervention in Iraq. I oppose that. To me, that was, you know, regime change without any kind of, there was no proximate rationale for it. I mean, I know all the arguments that have been made around it. And so for me, that's just harder to justify, mobilizing and using kind of democracy promotion and so forth in that case. In the case with Putin, it seems like, you know, it's a matter of self-preservation and about preserving some basic fundamental principles. The guy overstepped.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. And Carolyn, I mean, I'm just the same question to you, but could I just make this sort of preface to it? I mean, your comments struck me as being about states and relationships with other states, and that's, of course, what international relations is about. But at some level, international relations is about relations with societies. And to talk about Russia and China as though they have completely different values, how right is that? I mean, you yourself mentioned that just a couple of decades ago, there were completely different opinion polls in Russia than the ones there are today. And if we talk about China, well, it's not really China, but Lee Kuan Yew talked about Asian values and how different they were. Kim Dae-jung came along and said, well, hang on a minute, you know, we want these liberal values too. So how are we to embrace, how are we to use that understanding when talking about these emerging blocks and the fundamental difference of values between them?
Well, one way of thinking about it, and you're entirely correct, is that when we look at what has developed, let's take Russia and all of the claimed spurious or otherwise about the close ties with Ukrainian peoples, what you see there is Putin using a narrative which undercuts state rights in Ukraine to think about communities and common languages, common heritage, common religions. So, of course, that narrative is there too, beneath the state level. And what has also emerged, of course, in Russia, and it's very difficult to get reliable information, is that Putin's state doesn't rest on any real notion of the people at all. And that's where the leverage lies, it seems to me, that Putin's state is a very particular type of artificially created political elite, which even now doesn't include much of the military, which is why there is such a poor military performance. So you're probably right, and forgive me if I've been careless with my use of the word state, but if we pull threads on many different states, Mick's done it brilliantly in his book on the United States, but Russia is not one single thing. And I think we've got to be very careful when we're talking about this war. It's Putin's war. And what I would also say here is this war is completely changing our notions of war, because I think what's going to be absolutely crucial over the coming days and weeks is who's going to win the battle of the narrative. Because these stories we tell each other and ourselves about what the war is about remains absolutely key to support. But my point would be, we need to, Mick talks about, you know, the United States being hollowed out. Well, Putin's been doing that for over a decade, longer in Russia. And this war could be the undoing of him, because it is not a Russian war.
Thanks very much. Look, we've only got a few minutes left, so I think what I'll do is just ask Professor Cox if he has any last observations he'd like to make, picking up anything that's been said from the colleagues on the panel or anything else. I must apologise to the audience. We have an enormous number of questions which we haven't come to, but I do think it might be useful to hear at this point from Professor Cox.
Thanks for asking me that impossible question, Rob.
What's your thoughts, Rob?
It's impossible because so many complexities and so many great points. But maybe I'll just make one point, and it really gets back to this war. And I know people keep saying, well, can we talk about something? Somebody told me the other day, can we talk about something else? I don't think we can at the moment. It's not just, as Peter and Caroline have said, about this could run out of control. And I agree entirely what Caroline has said. This is Putin's war. It's not ordinary Russians' war. They have suffered under Putin in the same way that Ukrainian people today are suffering under Putin. So let's be absolutely clear about that. But I suppose what worries me most, and I suppose this gets back to the title of the book, is not just the agony of the United States and its problems, but also the agony of other states within this world system we're living in at the moment. And I think we need to widen that discussion out. And I think the agony we're now seeing manifested between Russia and Ukraine is a genuine agony, is a terrible agony. We see it every day on our screens. And I think there will have to be, somebody once said, all wars come to an end. Do you remember many years ago, Peter and Caroline? And this war will have to come to an end at some point. The question is what the terms and the conditions of it will be. And is there any way that we can actually renegotiate, and I think Caroline was hinting at this, the terms of the relationship between the West, the United States, Russia, and China going into the future. Now, I always remain a little bit of an idealist in this and a hope, an optimist. You've got to retain an optimism in the world because you have to, I think, you know, not without sound foundation. So I do retain that hope, the possibility of somehow pulling back from where we are. If we don't, then I think we are moving into an extraordinarily dangerous period in the international system. And it's not just the end of the post-Cold War era. I think it's going to open up a whole new world, way beyond anything we've seen over the last 30 years. And that's my concern. And I think knowing the danger, the very real catastrophic danger that lies ahead, not just in Ukraine, but elsewhere in the world, I think gives us pause for thought, pause for reflection. And how can we find the diplomacy and the wisdom to pull back from where we are at the moment?
Look, thank you very much. Thank you to all of you. We've heard from Mick Cox about some of the paradoxes that gave rise to the dilemmas that the United States currently confronts. And we've heard from Carolyn Kennedy Pipe about some of the missed opportunities, particularly between Clinton and Yeltsin, that might have led down a different path. And we've heard from Professor Trubowitz about a sort of core problem in which the end of the Cold War gave rise to difficulties as well as opportunities. I think we've heard a wide range of opinions about what might be done in the contemporary environment. So thank you all three very much on behalf of us here at the LSE. Thank you and good night.
Good to be with
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you again.
Rick.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, everybody.
Good to be with you, Carol.